Hi, I'm Helen, therapist, author, and your host of the I Don't Think We Talk Enough About podcast, where each week I'm joined by wonderful guests that bring their warmth, wisdom, and wealth of experience to subjects I just don't think we talk enough about. And this week, I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Ann Macklin. This episode marks the start of a new series of episodes on my podcast with I Don't Think We Talk Enough About Real Stories. Sarah is the founder of the hugely successful Live Well, Be Well podcast, founder of the Be Well Collective, registered nutritionist, TEDx speaker, international model, and health journalist. And the reason I invited her here today is to talk about her journey with self-compassion and how it's shaped who she is today, and how it's also helping shape so many lives through her compassionate, focused work. Sarah Ann, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure.
Aww.
Having followed you for such a long time and seen your growth and your wisdom and your compassionate heart, really. It's there, and it's really just so beautiful to have you on my podcast.
Aww.
Having listened to your podcast so many times, like, oh, she's coming on mine. It's so lovely. So thank you so much. And the reason I invited you on was I read your article in Harper's Bazaar about self-compassion missing from the story around self-care. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that's so right. It's missing in abundance, isn't it? It's that shift of actually caring about ourselves, about changing that inner narrative to something that's so much more caring. And I really wanted to talk to you about it because you've had such a journey. And I kind of sat there thinking, where do I start with Sarah Ann today? Where do I start? And I thought, I wonder whether we should start back at the beginning, really, when you were 15. Because your story is incredible and such an inspiration for so many people.
Thank you.
Oh, no, you're welcome.
It's so nice to hear because I think it's one of those... You said this before, and I'll go definitely to the story, but you said this before that there's so many experts out there, and that's something that I really pride myself in bringing the scientific rigor to the storytelling part that we're going to go into. But I think what's like really important is that I'm still on a lifelong journey of it. Yeah. And I think that's so important that when anyone speaks from an expert angle, we still haven't really figured it out. We're interested by it. And for me, to kind of cultivate more change and keeping that kind of education behind me makes me adopt and want to analyze those behaviors more. But so much of all of that work, and maybe you might resonate this as a therapist, you do it because it's touched you in such a profound way. And I think self-compassion, along with all the other work that I do with nutrition, is there because I've been through all those struggles. And it's why I'm so passionate about delivering the message. So I wanted to say that first, as in, the story is so fundamental, and then knowing that there's kind of research behind it to back everything up, for me, is even more profound. So I hope that, the listeners might resonate with this in some way.
And as you say that, I'm thinking, you've done the study, so it makes you think, oh, it makes sense. Same as a therapist. All therapists have come into therapy because they also have a story. Yeah. And it's that looking for the answers.
Yeah, seeking.
And finding them. And then it sort of settles over you like a layer of, that's it. Okay, that's it.
It's so true. Like, I was reading a book, and I'm definitely going to get to my story, but it twines so well to this, The Road Less Travelled, which is a very, like, it's a fantastic book. It's like one of the best-selling books in the UK. And I've only just started reading it. And for me, it really hit a moment where I opened the page and the first 3 words were, life is difficult. And it's that acceptance of, actually, life is really hard. And it's never going to be easy. And we have this imagery as we're growing up, or at least I did, that when I get to a certain point or when I achieve one part of my life, everything else is going to feel at ease. And the thing is, there is no ease. Life is really tough. And so much of that book says, I'm not saying anything profound that people don't know, but actually just hearing the commonality that all of us struggle and life is so hard and can be so unfair allows us to sit a little bit more with that ease. And I think that's where the self-compassion element for me of that common humanity sits so strong, that when you know it's not just you suffering, because suffering can be a very hard word to connect with, but life can be full of suffering. And so I think that acceptance with it helps you cope with it with more ease.
And I'm shocked you almost brought that in as the first thing you said, because before we came into this podcast, my daughter and I were chatting about life is hard.
It's really difficult.
And even hearing those words, you say you read those first 3 words, you didn't feel so alone, I bet.
No.
And we can feel so alone in our life, can't we? So alone in what feels a struggle, the silence that we almost engulf ourselves in.
Totally.
Around the stories that you think, no one else can see this part of me.
No
one else knows that I'm carrying this day in, day out. It's heavy.
It's heavy, yeah.
And then when you just read those 3 words, you think, oh, it's not just me.
No. And I think it's so hard to show those parts of you online. I think that's why I love the show that I do, because I do become very vulnerable in it, and I try to really speak from an honest perspective and not make it in a self-indulgent, but in ways that I know that people will connect and feel seen and heard. And I think, we're all in this world trying to figure it out. And to live your life imperfectly, I think, is one of the most beautiful things that you can do. But we've kind of flipped the lens to live a perfectionist life through someone else's eyes. We're trying to match someone else's vision. And you can see that from Instagram, or you can see that from analysing other people's relationships, or maybe other people's families, and how we always think everyone's got this perfect family life, and behind closed doors it's very different. But we never really realise that until it's just us going through it. And so I think kind of actually releasing that burden and knowing that when you're going through it, the connection to common humanity that everyone through their life is struggling is just such a huge lift. And I think I didn't realise that for so long. It could be a long time to connect to that.
And when you do connect, it shifts something, doesn't it? You don't feel so alone in it. But you wonder what we're all chasing. Because so many of us are living in that disconnect, that almost normalising the disconnect and settling there for a little while longer, as opposed to trying to carry on forward to something that doesn't feel like it's resonating with you either. And I love the way you said, living through a perfection, something along the lines of living perfection through someone else's lens, and actually coming back to self and what aligns with you. We're all different.
We're all different.
Hugely different. Different lived experiences. Different blueprint. So different. We can find common ground as well, which can be so soothing in the moment.
Absolutely. It's like when I'm sure somebody, or I hope at one point some of the listeners have connected to a friend or a loved one where they felt very seen, or they feel that they're going through something jointly. In that moment of when you can feel very seen by another person, allows you to have this huge kind of let go. It's not just me feeling this. And that's something that I think that we need to really cherish and remember in the times of real hardship, because we are not innately wired to be self-compassionate. We're not innately wired to feel content and ease. And even saying that, I think, lifts a huge burden, because we're actually wired from evolution to be self-critical, to fear danger. It's, it was for us a safety mechanism.
Survival.
It was complete survival. Yeah. And we've all heard of the terminology of, obviously, from back with the tiger chasing us, or the lion. But I think just knowing that our brain is not wired to be kind to ourselves, already we're okay, well, there is work that I have to do, that I have to really work to be kind to myself. And that's already a compassionate lens, as opposed to beating ourselves up as to why we're struggling. knowing that it isn't mapped in our minds to be that way is already kind of like, okay, this is something that we can learn and that we can grow, and we all struggle with. And I think that's already quite a nice place for people to start thinking about, you know, because so many times we can look and go, oh, they've got all their life together, or they seem so perfect and happy, and they don't seem to struggle, or they seem to cope with stress really well, and I feel really chaotic. And on the outside, it will always look like that, but our brains are innately wired to be self-critical.
Exactly.
So knowing that we're all like that is
And I think
human.
you're right. It's when we realise that it's a human condition, that we aren't broken, we're not wrong. It's a human condition. But we can also show up better for other people when we're more self-compassionate.
100%.
It shifts everything.
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest thing about self-compassion is it doesn't cost anything. It's totally free. Everybody can access it. We have to work harder to access it. But actually, when you can show the same love and respect for yourself and kindness to yourself that you can for another friend, you're going to show up better in every part of your life. And you're going to make decisions from a place of genuine care. As you would with your child, you would always want to choose that from a place where you genuinely think that is the best decision for them. And how often do we take that moment to think, is this the best thing for me? Or am I doing this just because I feel like I should? Or I'm being very reactive in the moment? And actually, when we can start making those decisions, we have so much more room and space and energy for others. And we end up becoming so much more less selfish, so much less self-absorbed when we can start doing that from a place of love.
Well, they say, don't they, that the more self-compassion you show gives you the ability to feel compassion for others.
Hugely.
It really is a benefit both ways.
Yeah.
I think, didn't they say that there's something, the brain studies, the scans of the brain, that when you show compassion lights up such incredible areas in your brain. You might know more about that than me.
There is so much research on this, because for me, self-compassion always felt like quite a woo-woo term. And I really struggled in that sense with, okay, well, how do I formulate this? Because self-love, self-compassion. I mean, to be honest, I hadn't really heard of self-compassion. I'd heard of self-love. And that made me feel quite hippie-ish and woo-woo. Not that that's a bad thing, but then trying to kind of cement that in science felt very disconnected. And then for me, my passion grew from nutritional science into mental health because of my dyslexia. And it was the first time when I started to feel self-compassion for myself, to start going actually as an understanding about myself, which gave me a lot more acceptance. And in that moment, I was really interested in, well, why am I feeling such a shift in my behaviors and in myself? And then I obviously went into a complete dark black hole into the research around self-compassion. And for me, it was the missing conversation around health, because everyone was telling people what to eat and how to eat it, or how to use their environment to feel better, or how to have movement to feel better, and all of these different kind of tools that we can use and protocols. But the problem was that why are they doing it was such a big kind of conversation for me. And I could see in my clinic that people were coming in with these kind of prescriptions that they wanted to reach. But it was all kind of from a place of like heavy criticism, as opposed to like a place of real love and compassion for themselves, that they should do it instead of like why they wanted to do it. And so that's where the self-compassion element really begins with the science, because we know that when we implement more self-compassion into our daily lives, we have reduced weight loss. But then it also works on the opposite end of the spectrum. It really helps combat poor body image, eating disorders, anorexia nervosa. We also know on the other end of the spectrum, it helps implement more of a growth mindset. You're more motivational. So telling somebody, if you think about this in a work context, that they're really bad at their job and they need to do better, and they're getting that message every week, after a couple of months, this person's going to be like, I don't want to work at this company anymore, because all I'm getting is negative criticism. If you flip that back to yourself, and that's how you're speaking about your work or your life every day, after a while, you do just feel like giving up. So we actually know that from so much research, it also helps improve motivation, growth mindset. So these kind of two things together are so impactful for our health. And to have that kindness and compassion is never been looked at in that lens. And that's, for me, the area of research that I find so profound. And that's completely missing from any conversation that
I agree.
I seem to have in this area.
But I notice with people that when they turn that self-compassionate lens inwards, they soften. Their sense of self becomes stronger. You talk about that in the article a lot around Dr. Kristin Neff's research around motivational. Actually, I've got it here because I screenshotted it.
Oh, yeah.
Self-compassion nurtures acceptance, whereas harsh self-criticism feeds control. When we berate ourselves with that inner critic, we become disconnected from our bodies and our emotions. Self-compassion allows us to approach ourselves with understanding and tenderness. And that was just so beautiful because we really start to see ourselves as a form as opposed to this criticism. There's an exercise I do a lot that I learnt through Dr. Scott Lyons in the Embody Lab. Don't know if you follow them, the Embody Lab. They're wonderful. And he talks about when we get so stuck in our mind and it's harsh and we're critical, it's just to tap down your body and just you take up form again. Like, who am I? What do I want? What do I need? Who is this person? And something else happens in that moment where we start to care for ourselves more as opposed to this horrible inner critic. But we are moving away from your story.
Oh yeah, I love it. It's so true because I'll be really so much like of my story is part of what you're saying is a disconnect that I had from my body. And I speak about it, and if you're a listener of the show, then you'll hear I always say, I think we're very disconnected. It's because I have been through so much of that. And even now this year, it's happened to me again, where I became very disconnected from my body in a kind of a whirlwind of stress, which is really important to highlight because I think so many times people can sit here and explain these concepts or something from the past they went through, and people go, oh, they figured it all out now. And like, life does still hit you in so many ways that you cannot control, and the body will respond in a different way to what your mind is. Your mind is insanely powerful, and your body normally can't keep up, and your body will be the first thing to go. And that's what's happened to me at the beginning of my journey. I was spotted as a model when I was 15. And for me, that was very transformative because I was a very curious child at school, but I always felt that I didn't quite understand where I fitted in. And in the sense of, I would sit in class and I would always be kicked out for talking because I wasn't processing what was really going on. So if you kind of said to me, what did you learn at school? It would be very minimal. And I was such a curious kid, but I just was very misunderstood in myself. And I don't think, I went to a normal state school. I don't think people didn't have the time to kind of understand me either. So when I was spotted and had this opportunity at 15, of course, that for me was everything. I wanted to grasp it. And I was spotted as a model. And within a couple of years, I was living in Paris. I was living in New York. My career took this very, very quick turn upward, which was not expected. I had this very, very successful career. And for me, looking back at that now, I spoke to Oliver Burkeman recently, who was a Guardian columnist, and he speaks about the anxious, insecure overachiever, which was basically how I would have defined myself very well back then. I felt like I had this opportunity, I needed to grasp it, I couldn't let it go, because for me, I didn't know what my other opportunity would be. And I was earning such a high amount of money at this point. I had a big social status. And all of a sudden at 23, everything crashed and burned. And I was hospitalized. I had kidney failure. I had sepsis. My body had like 10 burst cysts in my ovaries. Like all my body had internal bleeding. Everything was going on. And I remember waking up that morning and I was shooting for American Vintage and I kept taking Nurofen because my temperature was so high and I had such bad back pain. And I had to get through that shoot. There was no connection that I was so ill that I needed to stop. I had no off switch. All it was work and succeed. And I think a lot of people might have misinterpreted, why did I crash and burn in the modelling industry? Was there an eating disorder? It was nothing to do with that. It was the fact that I was living this intense pressurized life that my body just ended up not coping. And so after a few months of being in hospital and coming out, and by this point I was like 5.5 stone. I mean, I was so small. And I came out, went back to New York, and then my dad had a brain hemorrhage. And I got this call when I was in Central Park. And I remember my mum kept calling me, and I was like, kept cancelling. And I thought, actually, no, she keeps calling me. This is an issue. And she was like, your dad's had a bleed on the brain. I don't know. He's not conscious. I don't know what's going to happen. You need to come back. And when I went back to see my dad, I remember seeing the consultant, and I said, why has this happened? Because he was young. And he said, I think it's because of stress. And it was this moment where I hadn't analysed. I mean, I was young. I was in like 23, but I hadn't analysed why I was so ill in hospital and my body had stopped. And by this point, burnout, habitual burnout, that is the extreme, by the way. People talk about it, but that is the extreme. Didn't talk about anything back in those like 10, 15 years ago. So when somebody said that to me, it was such a big shift for me that it really made me analyse my life, because I remember sitting on that plane and not knowing if I was going to turn my phone on, if my dad was going to be alive or dead. I had no idea. And it made me analyse the things that were really important in my life. And actually, if I did lose him, I haven't been spending any time with my family because I've been so wrapped up in this other career. So when they said that, and then I kind of looked at myself, what I've realised kind of through my own journey is the compassion and love that I had for my dad, and the nearly losing him gave me the compassion that I needed for myself to basically try and save my own life. So I went back to school, which, if you remember, I hated it. And I don't know at what point made me think this is a good idea. And my mum was like, you do know that this was something you absolutely hated. And I was like, I know, but I don't know what other way. That I've got to understand like why my body failed. I've got to figure it out. And that's when my professor told me I was dyslexic, told me that I was smart, my brain worked in a very different way, and this is how you learn. And that unleashed something within me where I then learn at a different rate and a different speed than I ever have before. I have more compassion, I have more kindness. And it sent me on a completely different lifelong journey that I would never have expected to go down.
You wouldn't have touched, would you? You wouldn't have touched it.
I would never have touched. And I have so much kind of like recognition and thanks to that professor for telling me I was smart. It's the first person ever to give me that recognition, to give me the compassion, and to give me the guidance. And that led into a completely different paradigm of work that I went to do.
Of course it did. It changed you completely. It's about life experiences, isn't it?
That
change us so much. You could never have written that at 15.
No. Oh my gosh, no. I mean, I wanted to be a photographer. That is actually what I thought I was going to go and do at 15, was to be a photographer, and go and live a creative life. And then obviously I was randomly spotted, and that took me to a whole different career. And then a very kind of what I would now say was a midlife crisis at 23. My body shut down and had extreme habitual burnout and nearly lost my life. Made me pivot my career, but I've learned so much.
I'm sat here now thinking, I wonder what you would say now to that 23-year-old self.
I would say it's hard because I do believe, and I think I'm really conscious of sitting here telling a story, making it sound like I figured it out. I mean, I'm very aware of what the science says, but I'm very conscious that people have to go through struggles to come to a sense of understanding. And I don't think you can read your way through pain. I think so much about what we learn is through our experiences, and they're through some very painful ones. But I think that's where we get our biggest amount of growth. And so there's a lot of things that I think I could say to myself at 23 that I wouldn't listen to. And I would just kind of forget about it and move on. And I'm sure along my journey until 23, people had said things to me that I just turned a blind eye at, because, you know, my life wasn't at risk at that point. So it didn't matter. I felt very free. And I didn't have the emotional awareness and the emotional resilience to kind of cope with that. And I think it's a really important conversation to have, because a lot of people can meet this conversation feeling very uncomfortable, and you've got to meet somebody where they're at emotionally.
Always.
Otherwise, you can completely shut that door. And that's why I think the conversation around compassion is such a profound and important one, because if it's met with, especially with English people, with that cringe moment, like,
Isn't it? It is
love
that.
yourself. Oh,
Yes.
it's really difficult.
Yes, everything.
Right?
I know.
I then just say, explore it. If anything is met with resistance, that's what you need to explore.
Well, the resistance is the protection layer,
Yeah.
isn't it? So it's looking at what's it protecting, what's the function of that resistance. It's brave work, though.
It is,
It's really brave work, and I think you're so right. I loved where you said something around you can't read experiences; you have to feel. So you can't read. You could read all the self-help.
you can't intellectualize it.
You can't. You have to feel it yourself, and you're right. You have to feel that as opposed to just learning it.
Yeah.
It's feeling it. I wonder whether it might be quite important at this point to define self-compassion. You love Dr. Kristin Neff's work.
Yeah, I do.
I also love Gabor Mate's work on compassion. But I wonder if you wanted to just define self-compassion in your own words, maybe.
Yeah, I was going to say there is obviously like Neff's understanding, which is, and I would not be doing her justice if I didn't cite that, which is common humanity, knowing that, you know, we all go through times of struggle, self-kindness, being kind to oneself, and mindfulness, so being very mindful in that moment and not reactive. For me, I think I analyse self-compassion as befriending oneself. Being a really kind friend to yourself is really important, because I can think that already breaks a huge wall down for people if they're struggling with the concept. And I think that's how I started to look at it. Whenever I really struggle, I can find it so much easier to give advice to somebody, as we all do.
I know.
And sometimes I can hear myself saying this advice, and then I think, God, you're such a hypocrite. Why do I not do this?
I hear you. I really
Right?
hear you. I know.
And it's one of those things where I'm like, I feel like I'm a dear Deirdre to everyone else, but to myself, I am the opposite.
I know.
So much about self-compassion is befriending oneself, and becoming friends with yourself. That and I take out the love side of it, because I don't think it's about needing to love yourself. I think it's about being to like yourself, and allowing yourself to mess up, allowing yourself to make huge mistakes, and forgiving yourself. And that for me is like the essence of self-compassion. Because once we can forgive, similar to a relationship, if we can forgive our partners or our friends for when they've done something wrong, we should be able to meet that with ourselves. And so the befriending comment, I think, is such an important part of self-compassion, because I just feel like I find it much easier to resonate with that than anything else.
Yeah. I love the way you brought in like yourself there. That feels more manageable than love for some people. I'm thinking of some people I know that would really struggle with self-compassion. But liking, just bringing that level in, we're lowering a little bit of that loving ourselves, but liking ourselves. I love that. I'm thinking around how freeing that feels, how that acceptance just changes so much for us, doesn't it? That expectation is gone, that just
all gone.
That release.
Yeah.
And actually, I wrote it down because I didn't want to forget it. Gabor Mate's quote on, I'm a real fan of Gabor's work, actually, but he says, to cut ourselves off from our own natural self-compassion is one of the greatest impairments we can suffer. You let that sit and you think, it's so cruel, isn't it? We can be so cruel to ourselves.
100%. And I think, because if you thought about that in the profound term of, if you did that to a child, how would that child feel?
You wouldn't do it, would you?
You wouldn't do it.
You wouldn't do it.
So why do you do it to yourself, which is your longest relationship you'll ever have?
Is your longest relationship. And when you bring in the child work or the child aspect, I always think about the value of inner child work. And I always bring that in with self-compassion. It's not easy, but bringing in your younger self, that younger part, what do they need now?
Mm-hmm.
And very often the answer is in that, isn't it?
Yeah.
What do they need now?
Yeah.
Be that person they needed.
Yeah.
Show them that you are there for them.
Mm-hmm.
It's so powerful. It's so powerful. My book, Choose You, is out now and offers you ways to prioritise you, meet your needs, say yes to you, develop a more secure sense of self where you feel you matter, learn to set boundaries, wrap yourself in self-love, find your authentic self, and ultimately choose you in the same way you would want those you love to choose themselves too. Choose You, out now. There's so many other questions I wanted to ask you, but I wonder whether we can bring those in through the questions from my audience.
Let's do it.
Around tips for compassion.
Okay.
There's some lovely ones you have, actually, which I think will be really lovely to bring in. Whenever I put this out on Instagram, I say I've got someone coming in to talk about blah, 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 and I get lots of answers back. I was really shocked about the number of males that came back, but about in relation to their partners and their partners' lack of acceptance with body image. And
Amazing that they're aware of this.
they so cared to ask me that about their partner, but also that you say the awareness as well. So I've kind of amalgamated it into one question to try and cover in how to talk to a partner who struggles with body insecurity.
Such a good question. I really love that guys have written that in. I think that's just the self-awareness that they want to support their partner, and they can obviously see the beauty in them, and the pain that it's causing their partner is a beautiful quality, and it makes me really believe there's good men in the world. So firstly, that's how I want to answer that question.
Agreed.
Secondly, I would say it's a very difficult conversation to have, but I think the awareness, first of all, of the awareness that they can see that their partner is struggling with their body image is a very beautiful way to start, because it's not how they see them through the same lens. And so having that conversation in a very kind of, in a soft, approaching way, would say, this is how I see you through my eyes. And I think telling them everything that they love about them, about their body, how they see them, how they appreciate them, and say it from a real place of love, is going to make that person maybe first of all feel, oh my gosh, this is frightening. I feel like somebody's bringing out all these qualities that I feel very insecure about. But then asking them to write it down on a piece of paper and get them to look at it every day and remind them every day at the same time. Because I think it can be very hard to stand in front of a mirror and repeat affirmations if you don't feel that you feel them. And if you have a very, what it sounds to be like from these partners, very loving, supporting partners, making an effort to know that that's something that your partner is struggling with and saying it and allowing them to write them down and for them to say it in front of the mirror, but to also reciprocate that, is so strong that over time you're more likely to remember those words than the deep critical ones that come in every day.
You're bringing in neuroscience there as well, aren't you? Let's create new neural pathways. They take work. None of this is overnight, is it?
None of this is
overnight.
This
is a process. It is a process. And I love the way you brought in about the person they're talking about being able to see themselves through someone else's lens. Just maybe turn their lens, make it a bit smokier today.
Yeah.
Make it less clear. I thought it was a really considerate question.
Yeah, it's a really considerate question.
I really wanted to bring that one. This one came up a few times. I'm confident in my body, but not my face. I know, I had a similar reaction. And I feel that's always looked past when we speak about body acceptance and body image. It's almost like disconnect again, isn't it? It's focusing on the body. Any advice on how to feel confident in your own beauty that projects from the neck up?
Gosh, that's such a beautiful question. I'd love to know how old that person was.
There's a lot missing.
There's
in
a
these
lot
questions
missing in
anyway,
these
because
questions.
we can't see behind the person. We can only see what's being presented.
I think it's one of those questions I'm really trying to think about what would be for them the most impactful way to approach this in the kindest way possible. It's very difficult because I think there's a lot of focus on body image. And I have to say, body image is always spoken about in one domain. But I think on both ends of the extreme, whether you're thin or large, everyone suffers with body image.
It's really important.
And it's really important. I think when we get to the neck up, which is obviously the face, and I always talk about the neck up being more of the mind, and the neck down being more of the body and being more embodied. So at the moment, I'm naturally going towards this person is more in the mind of the self-criticism.
Yes.
I would love her to write the 3 things that she actually does love about her face down. Like, what are the 3 things that she wouldn't actually want to change that makes her uniquely you? I'm saying this is her. It could be a guy, so sorry about that. The 3 things that make that face uniquely them. What are those 3 things? What are those 3 things that make that so uniquely them? That is that real beauty. That's the one thing I would say to first of all start with. And then I would first of all start by saying, well, how do you see yourself when you look in the mirror? So if you're actually staring into the mirror and and it can be really uncomfortable, but you're staring straight into the eyes, who do you really see? What are those feelings that are coming up? Because for me, my natural reaction to that is that she doesn't like who she sees in the mirror, and maybe it's not just the face. There's a lot of uncomfort there. And so coming to a connection to the soul level of who she is or who he is, I think would be a really beautiful place for that person to start.
Yeah, I love that. And as you were saying that, about that looking in the mirror and also looking at the 3 things that you do love about yourself, that might be really hard for someone. I wonder whether also bringing in an element of, where's this critical voice coming from? Is it mine? Is it someone else's voice? Have I heard this criticism before? Am I seeing myself through someone else's lens and not actually my own? That real, and then again, bringing in inner child work. What would my inner child, my younger self, need to hear right now? What would help them feel better in this moment? Using what I like to say, the parenting brain. How can I parent myself in this moment? And for some people that might be difficult if their relationship with parents is difficult. But being the parent you would like to be for yourself in that moment. It's deep work, isn't it?
It's really deep. And I think although those 3 things could be difficult for someone to find, you will find those 3 things.
Yeah. I love your confidence there.
I really do,
Yeah,
because I think, like, I love my eyelashes, or I love my eyebrows.
I know.
Or I love my skin tone, or I love my hair colour, or I love my pupils, or I love my deep sense of connection in my eyes. Yes. I think there's so much that people can write that's not just the aesthetic part.
Exactly.
That's really important. And I think we need to really take time, as if you were to look at a partner and you would think, gosh, I really love that about them. And they might be quite shocked that you've picked up something that they would never have seen.
Yes.
Tiny things.
Yes.
And that's what I want them to think, like the 3 things that make them uniquely them. And I'll say, I've got kind of like a mole on my face, and I used to hate it, and I used to always cover it up and stick loads of foundation over it when I was younger. And now for me, I'm like, oh, I love that, because that is a sign on my face that is different, and that is me. And sometimes now I even enhance it, because it's gone from a hatred to more of a love. And I know that's such a minute thing, small thing to say, but it's finding the things that even that we find that we think are imperfections that make you so uniquely you, that is beautiful. And then being able to sit there and look, as I said, which would then bring up the work that you said, is very hard, but it starts bringing up the questions of, why am I feeling like this? And that's the next kind of harder work. And I think what is really important to highlight here is the compassionate work doesn't always bring good feelings. And it would be wrong for me to like not sit here and highlight that at any point, because it can bring up so many feelings of discomfort and sadness. And I think if that happens, to go and see somebody in compassion focused therapy who can help hold that space for you and guide you, because I don't want any of this work to sit here and sound deeply easy. And for people to go, well, I've started this and I feel like crap.
Yeah, and they will.
And
Many
they will.
Many will.
But there is like a beautiful ending to that if they keep going. And so I think it can be really easy to say, do this and do that and do this. But it brings me back to the original comment of life is difficult, and this work can be really difficult meeting yourself. But it can have a really beautiful ending.
I think it's the trust, as I said already today, trusting that process. And there are some really hard parts to it, and so many parts and layers that we touch. Think, oh, can't believe I touched that layer. Didn't know that was there, and then it uncovers another layer, and it's just that constant peeling back. It's emotional work.
It is,
but it's deeply connecting and understanding of self. Apart from how you would talk to a friend, because that's used a lot. And it's great. And I remember the first time I remember the first time I'd heard it, and it was in therapy. And it was so powerful. It actually made me cry. Yeah. Because I would never have spoken to a friend or expected so much of a friend as I was of myself. And it was, a very, very interesting moment for me. So apart from how would you talk to a friend, being a self-compassionate tool, any other tools that you would recommend for someone to use in their day?
Yes.
I know you've got lots. I know. But if you could, honestly, so I really do want this podcast to also have tips on how to be more self-compassionate.
So something that can be really helpful. So the friend one's always a really quick one, isn't it? Because you can think about that mentally on the spot very, very easily and go, wait, would I say this to a friend? No, I wouldn't. Why would I say this to myself? But if you have a bit more time and thinking of a tool to invest, something that is really powerful is a self-compassionate letter. And you can do this in so many formats. And I think it also really entwines well with another tool that I love and that I do is journaling. And I sometimes think putting the mind to paper and handwriting something out, you're actually allowing yourself to brain dump, but at the same time, you're really connecting your thoughts to a piece of paper. And the whole part of a self-compassionate letter is writing a letter to you from a very compassionate angle. So sometimes we might berate ourselves in a journal, we might put ourselves down, or we might be criticizing ourselves. And you can take yourself through steps of, if you're coming to a moment where you feel like you've let yourself down, or you've done something wrong, or you're angry at yourself, putting this down in a self-compassionate way can be a really, really helpful tool. Because it goes through these moments of mindfulness where you can kind of connect, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't have spoken to the person in this way. Like I can acknowledge that, but how could I do this differently next time? What does that mean? How does that make me feel? And you can start to take out all of those feelings that I'm a bad person, all of those feelings of shame and guilt that can arise. And you can start looking at it from a really compassionate way and saying, well, actually, I can understand why I reacted in this way. I can see where maybe I could have done things differently. But ultimately, I really learned this time on how that made me feel and that person feel. And next time, I really want to hold space to do it in this format and in this way. And to hold compassion that, one, you've done that is beautiful. Two, you're having such a deep connection to yourself and growth through all of this. But you're kind of giving yourself space and recognition that, like, you've made this mistake, you've acknowledged it, and it's okay. Yeah. And that is such an amazing tool to help us in those really hard moments when we really berate ourselves. And it kind of just allows us to say, well, we've acknowledged it, but we've done it from a place of compassion as opposed to a place of self-hate. And can pretty much guarantee that the next time these things occur, you'll think a lot more about it, because you've taken time to use that tool as well.
Because even the act of writing it, you're using a different muscle, aren't you? You're using a different part of your brain. You're giving it time. You're actually repairing work with yourself.
And I think something really important at the end to go, am I the only one who would do this?
Oh, beautiful. Love that.
And then you say, no,
No.
Every human on the earth has probably done this. Every person I know has probably had this moment.
I know.
And you go, oh, actually wasn't as catastrophic as I thought it was going to be.
You're so right.
It's such a beautiful moment to end.
Just being human.
I'm just being human. And this was another beautiful, imperfect moment that's cropped up.
And also in that letter, what I heard you saying was there was action of what can I do? So we don't feel so stuck in it or consumed by it. There's room for it to change.
Absolutely.
As opposed for it to stay stuck in the same. Sarah Ann, I loved that answer. That was beautiful. I'm sure you've got so many other tips. Actually, I would guide people to go back to your article. I'll link it in the show notes and obviously all your other work. But I have one other final question, which I ask all my guests, which is, what does it mean to you to choose you?
What does it mean to choose me? I think to choose me would be, well, obviously compassion is a massive part of this answer.
Yes.
To choose me is to be understanding and accepting of my flaws, to be compassionate with them, and to be compassionate with others.
Beautiful. Sarah Ann, it's been so gorgeous. I could talk to you for so long. I didn't even ask you all my questions. I didn't need to prep at all. I just needed to just invite you in.
Turn up.
Just turn up and talk. It was so beautiful to talk to you. You're such a gorgeous person, and I really love your work. I love what you're doing, and I urge all my listeners to go and check Sarah Ann out, actually. There's a wealth of resources there that will just leave you feeling really good. So, Sarah Ann, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So welcome.